can start. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Hello, everybody. Welcome or welcome back. So this is the last session of the Beauvoir Webinar Series 2023. And once again, we are thrilled to host three scholars whose works are brilliant and indispensable to Beauvoir studies and beyond. Before I introduce them, I just want to make a few announcements. First, the Society, Gina and I warmly thank our partners, the Department of Philosophy, Faculty of Arts and Letters at the University of Santo Tomas in the Philippines, and the Department of History at the University of Toulouse Jean Jaurès, because they've been supporting us from the very beginning in this project. And it's been 3 years now, and I am happy to announce that there will be a Beauvoir Webinar Series in 2024, and I will say more about it at the end of the session. The second announcement, or rather a reminder, we would like to invite you to join us and become a member of the Society from January. Membership comes with a subscription to our journal, Simone de Beauvoir Studies, which you all know, I'm sure. And it is also an opportunity for you and also for us to join a community of people interested in Beauvoir, but not only, also in feminism and politics, philosophy, history, and your support help us to organize our activities. So thank you very much. In French, because this is a bilingual event, n'hésitez pas à nous rejoindre et devenir membre de la société. Vous pouvez avoir accès à tous les numéros de Beauvoir Studies et recevoir les nouveaux aussi. Comme je disais en anglais, c'est aussi l'occasion de faire partie d'une communauté de personnes intéressées par Beauvoir, mais pas seulement sur des sujets très très larges. Il vaut mieux attendre janvier maintenant pour commencer un nouveau cycle calendaire et parce que les abonnements commencent en janvier. So now back to what brings us together today. This is a bilingual event, which means that our speakers are going to speak their native or preferred language, French or English. So it's been a challenge. Believe me, we're trying to find solutions to make our events as accessible as we can, but it is difficult and we can't offer simultaneous translations when the session is a conversation. We're not professional translators, and it's also a very, very demanding task. So we are sorry, but there's a solution. I think we can help each other. And I invite you to use the chat whenever you need a clarification, and anyone is welcome to help. And the second thing is, if you take notes, well, maybe you don't, but if you do, feel free to share them after the session via our Facebook page, and then people can use online translators to help them read them. So that's a way we can be a community. Donc, si vous avez des notes, si vous prenez des notes pendant la session, n'hésitez pas à les partager pour aider celles et ceux qui ne comprendraient pas l'autre langage. N'hésitez pas aussi à utiliser le chat pour demander des clarifications dans l'autre langage. On est là pour s'entraider. On peut vraiment créer un espace collaboratif et de soutien. Donc, n'hésitez pas. Let me introduce our speakers, and we'll introduce them into the opposite language to make their research more widely available internationally. First, our moderator, Katja Čičigoj. I hope my pronunciation is right, and I'm sorry.
So Čičigoj, but yeah.
Yeah. Merci. Katja est assistante de recherche et d'enseignement à l'Institut de philosophie à Klagenfurt-Celovec University. Et elle est doctorante en philosophie. Elle a publié de nombreux articles sur Beauvoir, Deleuze et Guattari, sur les féminismes matérialistes et sur Shulamit Firestone. Elle a traduit la dialectique du sexe de Firestone en slovène en 2019 et elle est en ce moment en train de travailler à un volume sur les utopies féministes du care et de la reproduction qui est à paraître en 2023. Elle édite aussi en ce moment un numéro spécial de Feminist Encounters sur les féminismes techno-imaginaires qui sortira en 2025. Et en janvier, elle lance avec Anna Český un groupe de recherche en ligne sur Beauvoir et la pensée marxiste. Je mettrai le lien dans le chat pour vous inscrire si ça vous intéresse. En revanche, ce sera en anglais, il me semble. Katja, tu pourras confirmer. So thank you, Katja, for accepting our invitation to have and moderate the conversation with Sylvie and Emily.
Thank you.
Sylvie Chaperon is a professor of gender history at the University of Toulouse Jean Jaurès, France. Her research interests include Beauvoir, sexology, feminism, and sexualities. She recently co-published a book on clitoris titled Idées sur le clitoris, Anatomie, politique et historique d'un organe méconnu, qui est apparu en 2022. She's still working on the history of this organ and she's preparing an online exhibition. We will, of course, share the news when it's ready. Her book, Les années Beauvoir, the Beauvoir years, published in 2000, is a historical study of the period commonly referred to as le creux de la vague, the period between the first and the second wave of feminism. And Sylvie was the first to replace Beauvoir and the second sex in their historical context. It was also a groundbreaking study of the scandal caused by the second sex when it first appeared in France in 1949. You can read her work in English because her article, Outcry over the second sex, was recently translated into English and published in Simone de Beauvoir Studies. So welcome, Sylvie, and thank you for accepting our invitation today. Et Emily est professeure de philosophie à l'université de Towson aux États-Unis. Elle est spécialiste en philosophie française contemporaine, en philosophie et théorie féministe et philosophie de l'environnement. Elle est l'autrice d'un livre de philosophie féministe très remarqué qui s'intitule Elemental Difference and the Climate of the Body, qui est apparu en 2021. Elle s'intéresse par ailleurs au statut du corps dans le deuxième sexe et aux différentes lectures qui en ont été faites. Et donc, elle propose une lecture à mi-chemin des interprétations déjà connues. Elle en parlera au cours de cette session, grâce aux questions de Katja. Elle a également coédité avec Anne Van Leeuwen, que l'on a déjà accueilli dans les Beauvoir Webinar Series et que vous connaissez donc, d'un livre qui s'intitule Differences, Rereading Beauvoir and Irigaray, qui est sorti en 2017. Et en ce moment, elle travaille avec d'autres chercheuses à une nouvelle traduction en anglais de Pour une morale de l'ambiguïté, qui est un essai de Simone de Beauvoir paru en 1947. Bienvenue, Emily. Welcome, and thank you for accepting to be part of this session. I am now giving the floor to Katja and our speakers for 1 hour or so, and we will then have a Q&A. Katja, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Marine. Merci beaucoup pour l'invitation. It's a real privilege to be here. I've been following the webinars for a while, and it's an amazing work you and Jean are doing. So thanks a lot for this invitation. I feel really privileged to be part of this and to be discussing these exciting topics of the body and sexuality in Beauvoir with two speakers like that, to amazing scholars and researchers, to amazing thinkers who approach these topics, of course, from very different disciplinary perspectives. And I think that's also what's exciting, what will hopefully also make for an exciting exchange from two very different perspectives. So to start discussing this topic of the body and sexuality in Beauvoir's work, I would like to invite both of you to tell us a little bit how your engagement with Beauvoir informed your further research on sexuality and bodies. So in what way did Beauvoir's own discussions about her own sexuality, about women's sexuality in general, the kind of reception that it gathered, sometimes outraged, sometimes enthusiastic, how did it influence your further research on sexological discourse in France, Professor Chaperon? And equally, I will then pose the question to Professor Parker, how Beauvoir's view of ambiguity has influenced your research on elemental difference and the climate of the body in your last book. So, Professor Chaperon, first to you.
Merci beaucoup. Je veux à mon tour remercier Gina et Marine, surtout Marine Rouch qui fait vraiment une animation de ces séminaires qui est vraiment passionnante, et je suis très heureuse que Framespa soit associé, Framespa c'est notre laboratoire, soit associé à cette entreprise. Merci aussi à Émilie et Katja pour préparer ces questions. Donc pour ma part, le travail, donc c'était quand je faisais ma thèse, que j'ai réalisé à la fois sur le deuxième sexe et sur sa réception critique immédiate, m'a vraiment ouvert les yeux sur l'historicisation des questions sexuelles, hein, pour prendre une formule un peu large. Donc, j'ai réalisé ce que cela voulait dire d'écrire depuis une époque, les années 40, où la libre disposition du corps des femmes n'existait pas, où les représentations pesant sur les femmes étaient très négatives et où surtout les questions sexuelles n'avaient pas droit de citer dans l'espace public, n'étaient pas un objet de débat démocratique. J'ai aussi été très interpellée par le contexte très particulier de la guerre froide, où se joue quelque chose d'assez curieux, puisque les communistes orthodoxes, c'est-à-dire qui suivent la ligne du parti, et les catholiques traditionnels, qui sont deux acteurs diamétralement opposés idéologiquement, se retrouvent en fait dans la même condamnation des questions sexuelles. Ils ne veulent pas qu'on en parle, ils ne veulent pas que ces questions soient débattues, ils jouent sur l'humour et la condamnation pour pouvoir continuer et préserver l'ignorance. Et cet intérêt pour la guerre froide mêlé aux questions de genre et de sexualité, j'ai continué à le travailler. J'ai travaillé sur la réception, par exemple, des rapports Kinsey en France. Et également, avec Marine Rouch, nous avons produit récemment un article qui analyse la réception du deuxième sexe dans la guerre froide à l'échelle de l'Europe, incluant donc une comparaison entre l'Europe de l'Ouest et l'Europe de l'Est.
Merci beaucoup. Yes, that's really great. I think, I mean, also personally, when I read your work, it was really eye-opening to be able to kind of see the context of the discussions that Beauvoir was also responding to, and then how you developed it further. Professor Parker, would you like to say a little bit about how you developed your own research on elemental difference, on singularity from Beauvoir's view of ambiguity and the body?
Yes, thanks so much. Thanks so much for inviting me to take part in this and for all the work that goes into planning an event like this. It's just an honor to be to participate. So my first book is a critique of the polis, which I understand to be as old as the tradition of Western philosophy, and yet never criticized as it should be, as a term that is both ecologically and politically false and problematic. And I understand the polis to be a quote unquote natural structure, which has at its apex man. And, you know, though there's been lots of criticism of man over the decades, the real problem is the polis, and also the centralization of a certain body, as if it is the completion of all of creation. And so the polis and the body, the one man who is the site of thinking which can transcend the larger structure. That's what my first book was about. And I think Beauvoir is an astute critic of the polis. I don't include Beauvoir in that book. She's not in the book at all. I don't think she's even mentioned even once, maybe once, but definitely there's no chapter on her. And it's simply because you can only fit so much in one book. But it's not because she hasn't had an influence on that book. I remember telling my colleague Laura Henghold, as I was finishing that manuscript, that even though Beauvoir isn't in the book, her influence on me is on every page. She rejected the body, absolutely. You know, never in like so many words, like the phrase "the body." I don't believe Beauvoir, Lacour ever criticizes it, but that's what the second sex really is about. On the whole, it is a criticism of the supposed universality of man as a body. And you know, I think her work, you know, in so many ways is making that criticism. And she's also I consider her to be an environmental thinker. You know, she's thinking about ecology and politics simultaneously all the time, searching for a thoroughly earth located ethics. in the Ethics of Ambiguity. So she was trying to live as a denizen of Earth without succumbing to the bourgeois scientism of her day. You know, so there's all kinds of pitfalls in trying to think this way, but she attempts it nonetheless, and her very life is a political experiment. So for all of these reasons, her intellectual engagements in general have been informing my work since I started reading her as a grad student.
Wow, yes, thank you. I think what's really amazing for me also in your work is the way you kind of really bring maybe unexpected lens, but at the same time, it's like it's things that you find in Beauvoir's works themselves, and I think scholars often stumble upon them and then either kind of put them under the carpet or problematize them sometimes. But like, yeah, you do something really productive with it, which I find really exciting. And I think what you said, where you're really speaks also to some of the articles that Professor Chaperon wrote about how Beauvoir was one of, well, she spoke so openly about sexuality, about women's sexuality, which wasn't discussed by women in the public sphere at the time, and which is also why it created this kind of outreach. And the way I think what you say is also, it puts this in a philosophical perspective. So how she kind of troubled this idea of the one body, the one kind of, you know, the one body leading to only one possible kind of sexual attachment to the others, the opposite sex, and so on. And she troubled exactly this kind of normative view. So I would like now to proceed to discuss precisely Beauvoir's, let's say, own relationship to non-heteronormative sexuality, to her own non-heteronormative, let's say, experiences, but also to how she discussed women's sexual experiences, same-sex attraction in the second sex. Professor Chaperon, you have written about how this kind of discussions were indeed ahead of her time, which is why they were also scandalous. But what I also find really fascinating is how you connect them to the narratives and discourses that actually were current at the time, women's literature about women's colleges and so on. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you view Beauvoir's discussion of same-sex relations, of homosexuality in those terms, in this tension?
Oui. Dans le chapitre La lesbienne du deuxième sexe, qui a vraiment été scandaleux, hein, qui a été très critiqué à sa sortie, de façon très allusive, parce qu'on ne parle pas ouvertement de lesbianisme. Mais en tout cas, dans ce chapitre, Beauvoir récuse tous les discours qui pathologisent l'homosexualité, que ce soit la sexologie, la médecine, la psychiatrie ou la psychanalyse. Et elle recuse aussi toute identité figée. Elle dit que la lesbienne masculine est un mythe qui n'existe pas véritablement. Et donc, elle fait du lesbianisme un choix en situation, dit-elle. Hein. Et c'est vraiment un propos très, très moderne. Et c'est assez paradoxal en même temps parce qu'à l'époque, il existe un mouvement homosexuel qui s'appelle Homophile, et qui adopte d'ailleurs l'existentialisme de Sartre ou de Beauvoir, enfin c'est la pensée dominante dans les milieux progressistes de l'époque, et qui insiste beaucoup sur le contraire, à savoir que l'homosexualité n'est pas un choix, qu'on est N-A-I-T, homosexuel, on ne le devient pas. Donc il y aurait vraiment une étude à faire sur la réception dans les milieux homophiles de l'existentialisme, et en particulier de l'existentialisme de Beauvoir ou de Sartre, parce que Sartre a publié aussi Saint-Genet. Bon, mais en même temps, il n'y a pas d'égalité entre homosexualité et hétérosexualité dans ce chapitre, puisque pour Beauvoir, la vraie authenticité, c'est d'assumer l'hétérosexualité tout en cherchant l'égalité en son sein. Après, je voudrais aussi ajouter que Beauvoir a été assez injustement critiquée par les lesbiennes des années 1970 ou même par des historiennes du lesbianisme comme Marie-Jo Bonnet, qui lui reprochent en gros, je simplifie évidemment, de ne pas avoir assumé une identité lesbienne. Mais là encore, il faut historiciser, si on se reporte aux années 40, quels sont les modèles lesbiens dont Beauvoir pouvait disposer. En gros, il y en a 3. C'est le modèle du saphisme, venu des femmes de la rive gauche, pour reprendre un titre célèbre et promu par des poétesses comme Nathalie Clifford Barnet, donc assez aristocratique et élitiste. C'est le modèle aussi de la lesbienne masculine et maudite, comme dans Un puits de solitude de Radcliffe Hall, ou encore c'est le modèle plus récent des amours collégiennes, dans lequel on comprend que les jeunes adolescentes soient fascinées par leur professeur, mais on juge très mal la professeure qui cède à ses avances. Et si l'on regarde comment Beauvoir présente ses amours dans ses mémoires et correspondances, alors ce sont des sources très cryptées, parce qu'elles cachent l'identité des personnes concernées, on voit en fait qu'elle bricole avec 2 modèles d'identité lesbienne, celui des amours collégiennes, et notamment elle insiste beaucoup sur le fait que c'est elle qui est constamment sollicitée par ces jeunes élèves amoureuses et qu'elle résiste énormément et que parfois elle résiste toute une année scolaire à céder à leur demande. Donc là, elle est dans ce modèle-là. Et puis, il y a aussi le modèle classique grec, masculin pour le coup, dans lequel la personne d'âge mûr initie son jeune compagnon et lui enseigne la philosophie. Et c'est exactement ce qu'elle fait avec ses jeunes compagnes. Je crois que Meryl Altman, qui est dans la salle, si je puis dire aujourd'hui, notait ça déjà dans un de ses articles. Voilà.
Oui, merci. Yes, this is also a very, there's also a chapter in her book, Beauvoir in Time, on the lesbian, which I think is also very fascinating, but I hope we'll have another opportunity to discuss this, or maybe in the questions. Yes, Professor Parker, I think the way you also read the chapter "The Lesbian in the Second Sex" as brings another perspective, of course, not necessarily in the context of its time. For me, what it does, it really brings Beauvoir's The Second Sex in dialogue also with contemporary feminisms, with contemporary ideas about non-binary gender identity, non-binary bodies, and trans feminisms as well. You say that the chapter "The Lesbian" shows that Beauvoir is not interested in gender duality. So I wanted to invite you to tell us a little bit more about your view of this chapter, "The Lesbian." In what way does it show a kind of a Beauvoir beyond gender duality or dualism, or a binary conception of gender, and beyond heteronormativity?
Beauvoir was skeptical of what Thomas Lacour has called the two-sex model in his book, Making Sex. And so in that book, he cites Beauvoir and the second sex as one of the major influences on his interpretation of the shift in the Western intellectual tradition from the one-sex model, literally the idea that that sex is one thing, that genitalia, which supposedly define a person's entire being, that among humans there's one set of genitalia differently located or differently oriented, and that's what makes a person a man or a woman, according to this one-sex model. The two-sex model, he argues, sometime in the 18th century, comes to sit alongside the one-sex model. The two-sex model is just a new version of the one-sex model, except that it understands there to be 2 sets of sex organs, perfectly opposite each other, and the entire anatomy is caused by those 2 sets of sex organs. So it's not that there's one sex either inside or outside of a person's body. You're a man if your sex is on the outside, you're a woman if your sex is on the inside, same set of organs. There was even only one set of words for these organs. Like there was no such thing as a vagina until the 18th century. There's a word. So in the 18th century, there's invented this concept of 2 sexes, opposite sexes, and these opposite sexes cause the nervous system's skeletons the entire being of the two bodies to be diametrically opposed. So Beauvoir, it seems to me, was working on that understanding of that shift from the one sex to the two sex model. Thomas Lacour's book Making Sex just makes it much clearer, and he credits Beauvoir with like putting him on that path to that argument. And so that's how I also see Beauvoir, as critical of the two-sex model, and also seeing the two-sex model as an iteration of Aristotle's claim that women are kind of defective men. But I don't think that Beauvoir manages to consistently question gender or sex dualism in her work. She's skeptical of the very gesture of sex, not only gender. I think that's how I would put it. Like she's skeptical of sex and gender both. I think in different places she's talking about cultural ideas, and other places she's talking literally about, there can be no rigorous distinction between the sexes, as she puts it in that lesbian chapter, The Lesbian. And Meryl Altman, who is, I think, on this call, as Meryl has argued that I agree that chapter interrupts the otherwise cis and heteronormative trajectory that Beauvoir is trying to explore in the second half of The Second Sex. Like, I think that's a very deliberate design of that book. But I have taught the lesbian chapter over and over again to undergraduates, and over the years I've gotten more and more cringy about it, because it's just not, it's got a lot of really a lot of claims that just don't sit well. It's very clear that Beauvoir was writing as what we could now call a cis bi woman, very much considering intersex women, for example, to be some other kind of creature, not relatable to her own sexuality, her own gender. So I don't know, I struggle with, but one thing I'm clear about is that Beauvoir was trying, as a woman with quite a lot of privilege in these categories, to think of, to understand herself. And of course, she lived in a time when it was, much more difficult, I think we can say, than 2023. I've been fascinated by Les Inséparables, as I'm wondering if others are. Like, it's such an amazing, adorable, like, if I could put it that way. It's just, it's just so clear how her understanding of her sexuality was something she was, very concerned to think through. She wasn't trying to do other people's work for them. She wasn't trying to speak for others necessarily. She was trying to understand herself. So I take all of that to be, like, she was, there's problems there. I wouldn't endorse her account in every respect. But insofar as she is concerned to think about sex, not just cultural ideas about sex, but like, quote unquote biology, she's interested in the problems with the two-sex model. I find all of that very, very ahead of its time, and a model for thinking in that kind of admittedly limited way.
Yes, thank you. It's very interesting that you mention, of course, like, I mean, it is a book of its time, that's for sure, and there are several passages that will make one cringe for several reasons. And what I also find really interesting is there's so it's very well. Someone once told me that every good book has at least some contradictions in it, so that there is no, it's futile to try to see a kind of systematic, very clean argument that will never falter, that will never contradict itself. And I think the tensions in Beauvoir's work are very instructive for me to think about. They are somehow, I realize after reading her work year after year, it's what really stays with me and kind of still triggers me to think. So yeah, I also wanted to now move on with you to discuss some of these tensions that I find particularly fascinating, and both of you have offered very interesting readings of some of these passages. I am now, first of all, thinking about those passages that some scholars have described as somatophobic or misogynistic even, where Beauvoir discusses especially female corporality, female corporal experiences of pregnancy, of menstruation, of giving birth, nursing children, and so on, as something like a crisis, being prey to the species, being passive, being in a way consigned to immanence. And I think, yeah, these are fascinating precisely because they're a bit kind of cringy, given what all the feminist theory that's come after it, and that's affirmed female sexuality and corporality. But I think it also speaks to something that some women will have experienced, or some female-bodied people will have experienced. And so, yes, I would like to invite you to tell us how you interpret those passages in your work, either as in its historical context of trying to denaturalize gender and sexuality and bodies, Professor Chaperon, in your work, or through a reconceptualization of the concepts of transcendence and immanence themselves in your work, Professor Parker. Who would like to start? Maybe Professor Chaperon, I would invite you to start.
Oui, merci. Alors, pour moi, ces passages expriment en fait deux choses, et là encore, en historicisant le débat. D'une part, en effet, il répète, mais avec critique, une vision naturaliste des femmes. Et cette vision naturaliste des femmes, elle est dominante à l'époque dans l'opinion publique, mais même dans quantité de sciences, et notamment les sciences médicales. Donc, elles sont sujettes à des faiblesses constitutives, elles sont vouées passivement à la reproduction, elles sont inférieures, même si ça ne se dit pas aussi abruptement qu'auparavant, aux hommes. Et en fait, historiquement, le corps, la sexualité, la maternité n'ont pas été travaillés par une pensée constructiviste qui interprète autrement les faits comme des faits construits socialement. Ça a commencé, bien évidemment, avec la question du droit des femmes, avec la question du travail des femmes, avec quantité de sujets qui ont été analysés à travers un prisme sociologique, mais pas ces domaines-là, qui restent encore fort clos dans une pensée naturaliste. Donc, ça ne viendra que très progressivement et très collectivement, avec à la fois les sciences sociales et le mouvement féministe prenant appui justement sur ces sciences sociales. Juste pour vous donner un exemple, le concept démographique de fécondité naturelle, alors je ne sais pas si ça existe aussi en anglais, qui est un concept de la démographie, et notamment de la démographie historique. Il règne sans contestation jusque dans les années 1970, où il sera critiqué radicalement par Nicole Claude Mathieu ou Paola Tabet. Alors même que ce concept est profondément naturaliste. Penser qu'il y a une fécondité naturelle, ça veut dire que la fécondité est de l'ordre des lois naturelles de la reproduction et non pas de l'ordre du social. Voilà, donc tout ça pour vous dire que cette pensée constructiviste, elle ne progresse que très lentement, et Beauvoir écrit à une époque où elle ne dispose pas de tout cet outillage du constructivisme, en tout cas dans ces domaines sur le corps, la sexualité, etc. Et après, je pense aussi que ces passages expriment aussi comment des femmes qui n'ont pas la libre disposition de leur corps vivent des expériences corporelles. Et comme le dit Beauvoir, on dirait que la femelle humaine lutte d'autant plus qu'elle est profondément aliénée par les lois de l'espèce, comme si c'était une division interne à la femme entre son corps voué malgré elle à la reproduction et son esprit qui aimerait utiliser la transcendance, être libre et se dégager de toutes ces contingences naturalistes. Voilà, donc les lois de l'espèce sont en réalité bien évidemment la construction sociale de la mise à disposition des hommes du corps des femmes, mais cette lecture-là, elle n'est pas possible dans les années 40.
Oui, merci. Yes, thank you. I think that's very aptly put. And just as an intermezzo, I'm happy you mentioned this example of natural fertility in demographic discourse. And I was reminded you also mentioned Nicole Claude Mathieu and Paula Tabet and this amazing essay that I'm not sure I don't know. It doesn't strike me as very widely read in the English-speaking world, at least, but natural fertility, forced reproduction, where she also reiterates this kind of critique of the idea of natural fertility and talks about functions of reproduction in society. So I think that's also very useful for. But I agree that in Beauvoir, one cannot expect to find that kind of conceptual distinctions yet, although she may have announced some of them. And then at the same time, as you theorize very aptly with this idea of unachieved epistemic break, she didn't manage to fully disengage herself from this kind of naturalist discourse. Professor Parker, how did you read these ideas about female bodies as immanent? I remember that you kind of give a very interesting reading for me of this conceptual pair, transcendence, immanence in Beauvoir, a reading that maybe we can discuss also later on. Sounds or it reminds me of a kind of vitalist understanding of nature as immanent and transcendent.
Yes, I read these passages that you've mentioned as Beauvoir's attempt to articulate the hostility that cis women, even white women, are made to feel toward their very own bodies in a context in which cis men are the neutral and the positive, as she puts it in the introduction. So immanence, as I read Beauvoir, is a mode of transcendence. It's a kind of self-punishing mode of transcendence. It's a way of inevitably having to go beyond oneself. There's no not transcending. But it's a mode of transcendence that is, like punishing is the word I'm thinking of, but I don't know if that's good enough. Like, that's cruel, that is life stealing, that is, probably why Zaza died, I think is what Beauvoir feels, I'm really interested in like the image in Les Inséparables and this Le Deuxième Sexe of the young woman who injures herself in order to be allowed to skip a social event, it's a terrifying thing that clearly haunts Beauvoir, and she's wanting to write about it over and over. Also, I'm really struck by André's inability to eat in Les Inséparables, which seems to me like, another instance of the like madness and danger and pain of even being a white cis woman. So I want to recommend Penelope Deutscher's essay, which is a little bit self-serving because it's in my edited volume that I edited with Anne Van Leeuwen, the Differences volume. But Penelope Deutscher's essay in that book is about the what she calls the dead camp of Beauvoir's work, the kind of self-harm that goes along with growing up in a context where your body is synonymous with disgust and dysfunction. And so I see Beauvoir as very wise about all of these. I think it seems to me that like if she were to wake up in 2023 and hear the criticisms that people make of some of the ways that she speaks about somatophobia, like I think she would be shocked. It's just like completely not what she was doing. She was absolutely, I think it's like so obvious to her that that's what she's arguing that it maybe doesn't come across as well as it should in this giant tome of a book. But it's she makes it clear from the outset that this is a study of the ways in which women are made to live, and their lived experience is self-harm and self-hate, and so it's very hard to feel the secondary status of misogyny when it's your very being, and so I think she's trying to articulate the intensity of it, and it doesn't come across that this is what she's criticizing. But I just think it's so obvious that that is what she's doing. And I also wonder if some of the contemporary misunderstanding, or in recent decades misunderstanding, also does have to do with the fact that we've only just since 2010 had a full, in English anyway, a full translation of the whole book. That's very recent. That's only 13 years. Like, before that, it was an abridged version that, didn't allow English speakers the access that French speakers had to the original. So I wonder if that plays a role too.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I think that's very important also to point out, and you're right. I think it's not, yes, the kinds of interpretations that are produced are going to be very much tied also to the kind of, the conceptual work, the conceptual structure available through translation. So yes, I think that's absolutely apt. I would like to move on to let's say to another kind of tension in Beauvoir's work that I find absolutely fascinating, and I'm still thinking about, and that is between this kind of on the one hand, that's especially present in The Second Sex. Beauvoir is talking, she has this amazing passage, I think, in the biology chapter where she's arguing with Hegel, saying that sex difference is not ontologically founded, as she puts it, that it's possible to imagine human existence that is not sexed, that does not reproduce sexually, but not a human existence without a body, or an immortal human existence. So I take this to mean that for her, sexual division, sexual reproduction is not in the same way conceptually necessary to think existence. And so she has this kind of moments. She also talks about intersex individuals with the, of course, absolutely outdated and now inappropriate word hermaphroditism. But so it's but the way she talks about this, it's the way I understand it is not as a kind of an aberration. There's females and males, and then we have some aberrations. But she says, well, it's clear that there's not, female and male is not such a clear concept. There's many people who don't fit this categorization, and that's it. She seems to take it as an indication of a variety of sexed embodiment. Yet there is this several passages in the introduction, in the conclusion, where she says women have always existed, they always will exist. Women as specifically embodied with she puts it with maybe not specifically embodied, but with a specific relationship to their bodies, to sexuality, to men, to children, which kind of does tie the concept of woman again to a certain kind of embodiment. So for me, this is puzzling. I'm not sure what to make of it. How to, again, of course, the book does not need to be congruent throughout. But where would you situate, let's say, Beauvoir's thinking on this issue, on sex binarism and gender binarism in the tension of this kind of passages that speak maybe against each other? Yeah. Professor Parker, would you like to go first now?
Sure. This is I was speaking about this earlier. It's hard to puzzle out. I think in part because I don't know that Beauvoir fully appreciates the amount of privilege that she has in the terrain of human embodiment. I think she's trying to understand the oppression that she experiences, which is substantial. But there's another side of being a white woman who is in language that is, was not available to her, gender somewhat normative, not entirely queer, sort of moving in as bi people do in straight and queer spaces. She had she was very in tune, as she should have been in my view, to understanding her oppression, but not so much to her privilege. And so that's what I think is problematic. Like she, I think that I share your interest in places where she talks about intersexness and transness and people who are marginalized in ways that she isn't. But I think that without that acknowledgement of oneself and one's position with respect to those folks, it's all going to come out a bit weird. So I would just kind of like this, this is how I think of it. She's skeptical of the two-sex model, just as skeptical of the two-sex model as the one-sex model. There's no such thing as sex without that political interpretive context, and also I don't know that she appreciates the danger of non-binary intersex trans lives in the fullest, in as much as I would like her to. So I think that I don't think that this makes her work not indispensable. I think it, for me, her work is still indispensable, with an acknowledgement of, for lack of a better way of putting it, her privileges as a certain kind of woman whose experiences were, limited. And yeah, I guess if there were more conversation about that in the book, I think that would be amazing. But I also think I have had the privilege of reading decades of work that came out more recently around the many, the racial privilege, the ways that the degree to which to be a feminist really requires being an anti-racist, being an anti-colonialist, being, Beauvoir was an anti-colonialist, but I don't hear in her work an acknowledgement of her privilege as a white person. It's just not there enough for me, even though she's talking about it. So yeah, so now I'm kind of like, but I don't know if you can, if you're here, if I sound like I'm kind of like, my answer to this question is less clear. It's because I'm genuinely less clear about it. She's in some ways offering indispensable tools, and in other ways not thinking enough about her own privilege, is what I would say.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's an amazing answer, and thanks for also, yes, bringing in this kind of reflection about her privilege, which yeah, I mean, it can get I suppose when I'm reading these kinds of passages and I'm myself excited and inspired by what one can find there, it's then easy to let these kinds of concerns go into the background, and they shouldn't. So yeah, thank you for bringing this bringing in how that is actually tied to yes, her own position, and the way she's not reflecting about it enough, maybe. Professor Chaperon, what is your view of this tension also in the context when Beauvoir was writing? Professor Parker mentioned the work of Thomas Lecoeur on one-sex model, two-sex model, but so in the context of discourses about biological sex and sexuality, how do you see then Beauvoir affirming this duality of sexes and so gender as coming from sex in a way in this affirmation of the eternity of women, but at the same time also opening these arenas of thinking sex in a plurality of bodies.
C'est sûr qu'au moment où écrit Simone de Beauvoir, le modèle du deuxième sexe, il est vraiment dominant. Il s'est installé pendant tout le 19e siècle et il n'est pas encore véritablement contesté dans la première moitié du 20e siècle. Donc, ce dont elle dispose finalement, c'est une vision extrêmement genrée de la nature des sexes. Et les quelques passages dans le deuxième sexe, vous mentionnez le discours sur un hermaphrodite ou le discours sur un corps qui ne serait pas ontologiquement sexué. Je pense qu'ils sont très, très minoritaires dans cet ouvrage. Elle affirme que les sexes ont toujours existé, que la division des sexes est une donnée de l'humanité, donc elle partage cette idée-là, ce qui n'empêche pas d'ailleurs une vision un peu historique, puisqu'elle dit régulièrement que quand elle emploie le mot femme ou le mot homme, il faut entendre dans l'état actuel de notre société. Autrement dit, s'il y a toujours eu des femmes et des hommes, il y a eu aussi des existences historiques de femmes et d'hommes contextuelles. Bon, mais ceci dit, la division des sexes en deux, c'est une donnée qu'elle ne conteste pas. Elle n'a pas vraiment les moyens à l'époque de le contester. C'est massif comme argument. Et là encore, je pense que le naturalisme, c'est un énorme corpus intellectuel et culturel, et une seule intellectuelle, même très brillante, elle ne peut pas le combattre. Pour substituer un raisonnement différent, donc c'est-à-dire pour genrer les sexes et non pas naturaliser les sexes, eh bien il faut que tout un travail en amont des sciences sociales et des féministes ait été fait. Or, à l'époque, les sciences sociales, elles commencent tout juste à se substituer aux sciences médicales dans le domaine de la sexualité. Les enquêtes de Kinsey, par exemple, qui datent de 1948 et de 1953, donc qui entourent le deuxième sexe, apportent vraiment une nouveauté, puisque pour la première fois, on a une vraie enquête sociologique des pratiques sexuelles sans un regard moralisateur. Et Simone de Beauvoir parle d'ailleurs de cette enquête. Mais voilà, c'est un travail qui commence tout juste. Et puis par ailleurs, à l'époque, Beauvoir n'est pas entourée par un mouvement féministe dynamique, en tout cas sur ces questions-là. Le féminisme de la première vague est vraiment à l'étiage et le féminisme de la deuxième vague va commencer à apparaître au milieu des années 50, notamment avec le combat pour libéraliser la contraception.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Merci. There is another, let's say, a view of related to the understanding of the body that I would like to invite you to reflect upon and discuss with us, and then I would slowly open the floor also to the public if there are questions, comments, concerns. I was thinking about this again. It's probably true, like you both also mentioned, about these passages of let's say a more than dual understanding of biological sex in the second sex. That those are kind of marginal passages, but they are there in the biology chapter. Beauvoir talks about life itself as exhibiting a kind of tendency to transcendence and a possible lapse into immanence. So she gestures towards a kind of, what seems to me, a kind of vitalist understanding of nature and life. And on the other hand, we all well know, and there has been a lot of also very valuable research work done to unearth Beauvoir's phenomenological, philosophical background and perspective on the body and other issues. But so we are discussing bodies and sexualities here primarily. And so she, of course, also emphasizes over and over again how no physiological facts have any meaning in themselves. They are always gain meaning in a world of values, as she puts it. So in a concrete historical, cultural, social, economical, technological situation. So yes, again, maybe it's a kind of overall framework of the book, and then small passages that disturb it. Do they disturb this framework? Are they something else or not? I wonder what are your thoughts about this. Professor Parker, you also highlighted those passages in your own interpretation of transcendence and immanence in Beauvoir. How do you read this kind of phenomenological view of the body, and at the same time a kind of vitalist and interpretation of life and nature?
Yeah. So your question is about whether I read Beauvoir primarily as a phenomenologist or vitalist.
Yes, that would be one way of approaching. That would be my kind of way of approaching it. But maybe those two passages can be seen also in another framework.
I think this is such a great question, and it's one that I was in the background of the Differences book, but I haven't myself worked on a definitive, like I haven't worked specifically on this question, but I think that the beginning of an answer would be that Beauvoir's work is not reducible to either side. She's not a phenomenologist, given that she's interested in more than a kind of universal consciousness, which I'm sure phenomenologists will dispute. Phenomenology is a lot of things, but it seems like she's so interested in, for lack of a better word, materiality, that it's hard to think of her work as phenomenological for me. But at the same time, new materialism and and vitalism before it was, this is a lot of what Elemental Difference and the Climate of the Body is about. I read these literatures as tending toward a lack of political analysis, and Beauvoir's work is always about the polis, in my view. As you were saying, she doesn't think there is such a thing as materiality in an apolitical view. So I think she's hard to categorize, like great thinkers usually are. She's not a part of any of these movements. She can't be interpreted only in relation to one or the other. But again, I haven't, to be really honest, if I write a book on Beauvoir, this is what it will be about, like the way that she is not, she's thinking about materiality in a way that is very much her own. I guess I really resist the idea of her as a phenomenologist. But again, so That's
Yeah,
my non-answer.
no, thank you. I think that's going to be a very fascinating book, and I agree. I mean, the kind of traditional way phenomenology is seen would, I mean, yeah. Anyway, there's a very interesting article also from Stella Sanford about how critical and feminist phenomenology, whether it can do without this concept of transcendental subjectivity and kind of universal notion of the subject and consciousness. And I agree that's an issue for phenomenologists. And so with Beauvoir, yeah, whether she was one and in what way and how she changed then the discourse and took it up, I suppose that's also the question. And I agree with you that it's not like, yeah, it's not also a question to say she was this or that, but it's interesting for me to see those kinds of different approaches to maybe the same topic that somehow I'm wondering why does she say this if her framework is like, so this kind of issues fascinate me. Professor Chaperon, do you have any thoughts on this, on the kind of philosophical intellectual frameworks that Beauvoir deployed to think the body, and in what way are they in contrast with each other? You spoke and wrote about naturalism, of course, about how she tries to move outside of this framework but remains tied to it. And would you see this kind of more vitalist understanding of life as transcendent, immanent, as part of that kind of naturalism, or how to see that in the context of the ideas that were around when she was writing? Sorry.
Je ne sais pas, je ne suis pas philosophe, donc c'est une réponse de béotienne, on va dire, mais ce que vous comparez à une conception vitaliste du corps, pour moi, c'est effectivement l'influence de l'existentialisme qui se manifeste là, puisque le sujet chez Beauvoir, il est incarné, il est corporel. Le sujet, ce n'est pas un esprit pur, il est dans une situation corporelle. Et il est défini par sa liberté. Ce qui définit l'humain, c'est sa liberté. L'humain est en quelque sorte, c'est ce qui le différencie de tout le reste, et il est libre. Et donc, c'est d'ailleurs ce postulat de départ, avec lequel d'ailleurs on peut être complètement en désaccord, mais c'est ce postulat de départ qui fait que Simone de Beauvoir lutte contre tout déterminisme. Si l'humain est libre, il ne peut être déterminé, ni par sa place dans la lutte de classe, ni par son inconscient révélé par Freud, ni par la biologie. Donc, voilà. Après, c'est une réponse qui n'est peut-être pas très argumentée parce que voilà, l'existentialisme est une philosophie. Je ne suis pas philosophe et je ne connais pas forcément très bien l'argument qu'on pourrait donner à cet égard.
Oui, yeah, merci beaucoup. Yes, thank you for accepting this. The challenge to kind of the maybe provocation to think through with me through these aspects that really fascinate me. Maybe to conclude and then move on to questions from the audience. I will try to pose my last questions together and then give you each of you the opportunity to respond. And those questions have to do more maybe now with really your own work, your own your, let's say on a meta level, your own approach to bodies and sexuality and Beauvoir. And so I was wondering on the one hand, Professor Parker, you, I said, I told you that I found very inspiring these ideas about bodily plurality and singularity also in Beauvoir, in the Ethics of Ambiguity and her other works. But I was also wondering how one thinks oppression, systemic oppression, when if one thinks about bodies and subjectivities as irreducibly singular and plural, well, singularity is what you use, or elemental differences among bodies, so that there seems to be nothing that brings them together. And also then the question is, why do we tend to understand oppression as tackling groups of people? And of course, membership in these groups is always a disputed thing, but yes, so that would be one question. Yes, maybe would you like to reply, and then I move to Professor Chaperon.
Yeah, this is just such a great question. It's a challenging question. I think that Beauvoir is not quite conscious in the writing of what I would call intersectional authoritarianism of white capital wielding men. Like, she's interested in, whiteness. She's interested in capitalism. She's interested in, men and their power. But it doesn't all come together, in my view. I mean, I'd love for somebody to disagree with me about this, but the kind of authoritarianism of that structure taken as a whole, white capital wielding, ability having men, not just men, but a certain kind of man, such that there are many men who are not powerful, so her work, in my view, doesn't quite put all of this together. So, for example, Catherine Sophia Bell's concerns with Beauvoir's inability to think intersectionally about sex is right, in my understanding. I think that work is really important. However, this doesn't mean that Beauvoir's work doesn't offer tools for such a project. And I think that one such tool is the concept of singularity that you've mentioned, the ways in which to be, for example, a woman of whatever sexuality, race, ethnicity, gender, language, is to be for oneself, not a sex organ, but a body in the world in such a way as to have to live oneself as body, It is not to be a kind, I think Beauvoir rejects that, but it's also not to be a nominalist individual. I think she also rejects that, but a body that develops in the context of systemic forces with which it must grapple. So that would be my answer. But I think it's just like what you're posing is just an incredibly great question for Beauvoir, I hope that goes some way towards a response.
Yes, thank you. Yes, it does. Yes, thanks. Professor Chaperon, just to kind of tie up the discussion, I would also like you to help me reflect on the notion of temporality that we engage or perform or reproduce or imply. Let's say maybe the best word is imply when we offer our interpretations. The essay you wrote about Beauvoir's unachieved epistemological break with naturalism was, I think, groundbreaking in interpretations of Beauvoir. What I found though is also that it kind of well, of course, it puts Beauvoir in a historical context, in the historical development of thought, which is somehow linear. It's a progress from Beauvoir to the MLF in France, to anti-naturalist discourse. And so I was thinking if there's another way in which we can approach past work, and also in relation to contemporary feminist discourses, which might present past work as outdated, as irremediably binary, and so on. Is there? Did you think on this kind of meta level of how another way of approaching past work temporally is possible, without seeing it as a previous step that now we can abandon, but maybe there are points there that we can still find useful today, or maybe even only see as useful today, and they didn't appear as such back then?
D'abord, je voudrais dire qu'il n'y a rien de linéaire hein, dans l'évolution du féminisme. Et il y a toujours eu une pluralité de féminisme. Et d'ailleurs, il y a des courants féministes naturalistes, hein, des courants féministes qui affirment que la féminité est une essence, hein, et qu'elle est naturellement différente à la masculinité par rapport à la maternité, à la petite enfance, à la lactation, etc. etc. Et le fait est que Beauvoir, elle a vécu une période ascendante du féminisme, puisque les années 50, 60, 70 et encore 80, il y a vraiment la montée de cette deuxième vague, enfin les prémices, puis la deuxième vague. Donc elle était effectivement dans un courant ascendant. Mais on sait très bien qu'après ces courants ascendants, il y a des gros backlash hein, et que ce qui avait été contesté théoriquement par le constructivisme ne touche pas toute la société. Il y a plein de gens qui continuent à penser comme par le passé et quand ils se sentent les coups des franches et quand ils sont en position d'imposer leurs idées, ils vont avoir des discours extrêmement réactionnaires et réaffirmant une différence des sexes absolument binaire. Hein. Et puis, il y a aussi des nouveaux mouvements sociaux qui ont transformé les conceptions du sexe. C'est effectivement les féministes, on en a parlé, ce sont les homosexuels aussi, ce sont les trans qui ont beaucoup plus œuvré à la libre disposition, enfin la libre autodétermination de son genre propre, hein, un mouvement qui n'existait pas ou de façon extrêmement marginale en quelques personnalités du temps de Beauvoir, et puis les mouvements intersexes qui ont refusé les corrections chirurgicales du sexe. Donc là, on a des mouvements qui arrivent à faire en quelque sorte à dénaturaliser le genre. Hein. Enfin, c'est un peu paradoxal de parler comme ça, mais à genrer le sexe. Enfin, je ne sais pas comment le dire, mais beaucoup plus que Beauvoir ne le faisait. Après, je pense aussi qu'il faut voir que Simone de Beauvoir, je pense, en tout cas c'est visible dans le carnet de jeunesse, peut-être pas toujours partout, elle se pense comme une bisexuelle. Alors pas au sens d'ayant une double orientation sexuelle, mais au sens de mélangeant en elle-même le masculin et le féminin. Hein. Elle se pense femme comme étant sensuelle, dotée d'un corps, capable d'être une grande amoureuse, etc. Mais elle se pense aussi masculine, notamment parce qu'elle pense qu'elle a un cerveau hein, tout à fait égal à celui des hommes, etc. Donc, elle se construit une sorte de fluidité de genre, on va dire ça comme ça. Alors, bon, moi j'avais vu ça surtout dans le carnet de jeunesse, ce serait à poursuivre comme remarque.
Merci beaucoup. Yes, that's a wonderful emphasis also to end with Beauvoir's own understanding of her own gender and sex identity. And you also wrote about about how she thought of herself as female and male, or a woman and a man, and how that was related to how men were perceived as rational, and how she was told that she's as rational as men, and kind of reproducing those polarities and traditional roles, but at the same time, thinking that it's possible to embody both. Thank you so much for responding so amazingly to the questions that I posed. I would like to invite anyone in the audience who has a question, a comment, critique, a thought about what we discussed about bodies and sexuality in Beauvoir and in the work of Emily Parker and Sylvie Chaperon. So you may raise your hand in the Zoom and voice your questions or comments, or post them in the chat as you prefer. Meryl? Yes.
Hi, thank you. This has just been marvelous. This has just been a very intellectually fruitful interchange, I think, and You know, I think my question is, in a way, the same as Katja's question, but I'll put it a little differently. It's a methodological question, which is how to integrate the careful historical understanding with a sense that, with, for lack of a better term, a philosophical approach that is looking for, so to speak, timeless truths in the system of thinking. You know, how to be doing both those things at the same time. It's not obvious, right? And then also the maybe it's a third, maybe it's part of the philosophical thing, or maybe it's a third thing, which is the political desire to find, people always say, serve as a resource for, you know, but to find weapons or to find, you know, what am I trying to say? To find something that can be used in what seems most urgent and most pressing now from a feminist viewpoint. And, you know, so I can say more clearly how not to do this, right? We don't want to be like Thomas Lacour, for one thing, and be creating massive historical narratives of change that do not hold up to the scrutiny of anyone who works on the actual period that he's talking about, right? So I just have to say something about that. But more to the point for us, you know, the things that the second wave lesbian feminists did that now look very limited to us, but that were coming out of the needs that people had then to confront what was harming them then. Let's not do that, right? But that's easy to say. I mean, let's not right now, in a way. Sorry, this isn't really a question, but everybody always does this. Why not me? You know, how to not right now in a way that will look to in 20 years like the critiques of Beauvoir in the second wave look to us now. That's not obvious to me. And I would really like to know what all of you think about that.
Yes, thank you. That's an amazingly important question. Does someone of you want to respond?
Sylvie, I think this is for you. I think his question requires a historian. Philosophers can't be trusted to answer this question well.
Pardon, j'ai plus vu un commentaire qu'une question. Et puis en plus, comme je suis pas mal perturbée, j'ai pas tout suivi. Mais je retiens cette première question qui est de comment on peut conjuguer un travail historique sur Beauvoir avec un travail philosophique, étant donné que les philosophies se présentent souvent comme en dehors de tout contexte et en dehors de tout temps. Moi c'est ce qui me perturbe en fait dans le deuxième sexe. C'est cette pensée existentialiste qui se présente comme en dehors de tout contexte, comme des sortes de vérités ontologiques, et qui, à mon avis, handicape Beauvoir dans ce qu'elle veut faire. Ce n'est pas une pensée qui permet de penser les rapports sociaux et la domination. C'est une pensée qui étudie des rapports éventuellement interpersonnels, mais elle le dit elle-même d'ailleurs, hein, dans les années 70, elle dit « j'étais trop idéaliste, j'étais pas assez matérialiste ». Donc elle le reconnaît elle-même. Après, il y a des passages qui sont essentiellement d'ailleurs dans l'introduction et la conclusion du deuxième sexe, où elle compare, et c'est assez intéressant parce que c'est là où elle s'appuie effectivement sur des penseurs noirs américains, où elle compare la situation des ouvriers, où elle compare la situation des Noirs, la situation des colonisés avec la situation des femmes. Et là, il y a des moments voilà, où on aimerait qu'elle creuse, parce que là, on est effectivement dans une pensée des rapports sociaux de domination. Mais ailleurs, et de façon dominante, l'existentialisme ne permet pas tellement de faire ça. La philosophie existentialiste.
Merci. Emily, would you like to add something? Or...
No, I just thank Meryl for the question.
I think it's something we all will be thinking about for very long. I mean, it's one of the. I was thinking when you posed it at the end, when what you said at the end, I was a bit pessimistically thinking, I don't know, is it possible to avoid avoid producing work that will ever feel outdated, or like there's at least something in it that is so much tied to its time that maybe it cannot survive as a tool now, but maybe there are other aspects that then do survive, like why we read Beauvoir today still, or other thinkers so many decades after it was written, after she wrote. Yeah.
And if I can come back for a second, maybe that's not a problem, Katja. You know, I mean, if you think about Sartre saying that, you know, writing should be like bananas, that it should not hang around, or what Beauvoir says in the China book about this will be out of date in 10 minutes, and that's a good thing. She doesn't use those words, but and she was right, it was, but that she was trying to capture a certain thing. But I think the more one can avoid speaking oneself from nowhere, you know this, right? The less likely, the more useful it's going to be later. That's my own that's my own view. But you know, we don't know what's going to happen. And that's important to remember.
No, yeah, I think that's very useful. It's it goes back to what also what Emily was saying about about reflecting how Beauvoir did or did not reflect her own position and her own privilege. And I agree. It's where I mean, yeah, it's also where she talks about her own experience as her own, that those parts are resonating then with others. I think there's a Elaine Stavro. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. A few things. One, I was going back to what Emily was saying and sort of picking up what Sylvie was saying, which is about the vital materialist versus critical phenomenologist. I don't believe, I think it's very trendy to think of her as a vital materialist, but I mean, I just don't read her that way. I mean, as an existential critical phenomenologist, I think there's much more to be gotten through that. She's, you know, the importance of history and politics, Emily, as you said, I think leans her towards more of a existential critical phenomenologist, and the importance of the social, which of course is decimated in the post-humanist and vital materialist turn. In addition, I think maybe we're asking too much of her to say, is she, you know, does she offer tools, the toolkit idea? Because maybe she just resonates with certain things and our times. And that's, you know, she's introduced certain concepts and ways of thinking, which we still find useful. And in the book on the toolkit, my chapter did see how a notion of situated, embodied self allowed for affect, but an embodied affect and choice, which is significant and important in politics today. So I just wanted to make that comment anyway.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oui, mais moi je suis complètement d'accord avec ce commentaire. Et puis je pense que ce qui fait la richesse de ce travail, c'est son côté kaléidoscopique et qui part dans tous les sens et qui aborde tous les sujets avec des sources extrêmement variées. Et notamment, y compris les sources littéraires, mais aussi des confidences de ce qu'on lui a raconté. Et là, Marine Rouch pourrait parler justement de tout ce courrier qu'elle a reçu et qui va alimenter sa pensée féministe au fur et à mesure de ses publications ultérieures. Et je pense que la vraie force du deuxième sexe, elle est là, dans cette richesse. En fait, chacune plutôt, peut trouver quelque chose dans le deuxième sexe, va sauter des passages qui ne l'intéressent pas et au contraire, lire avec passion des passages. Et il y a des choses extrêmement concrètes, extrêmement bien décrites et finement décrites sur le travail domestique, sur les règles, sur l'odeur des règles, sur le corps qui se transforme à la puberté. Et tout ça, ça n'existait pas ou très peu. Donc, la vraie richesse, je pense, du deuxième sexe, elle est là, dans cette pluralité d'approches.
Oui. Merci. Emily, do you have yes. Do you want to respond as well, or?
No, I don't think I have anything to add. Just thanks for these thoughts. This is great.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we're Marine, are we moving towards the end of the time that we have, or?
Yes, unless there are more questions. If there are, we can maybe take one or two more, but if not.
Okay. Is there any more questions, comments, thoughts?
Okay, so maybe we can stop.
We can wrap it up. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
For a very interesting conversation. I don't want to take more of your time, but I just want to say that I always find it very, like Mary said, fruitful to listen to conversations between scholars who are from different disciplines. And I think we only did that 2 or 3 times in the series, and there are already 13 sessions of the webinars. And I think we will do this more often because today, listening to your historical and philosophical perspectives together offered a different, maybe clearer vision, at least for me, on Beauvoir's account on bodies and sexualities, and this is very, very interesting. And for this, I think we owe a lot to Katja because she successfully brought together Sylvie and Emily's work, and bravo for this, because it's not easy, and it was, for me, it was a success. This was very interesting. Thank you so much, Katja, Sylvie, and Emily. I just have 2 very, very short announcements before wishing you a good weekend. And I'm gonna share very briefly my screen. If it Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna do them in French because the slides are in English. Le premier événement, c'est le groupe de lecture que Meryl organise en 2024 et que l'on est déjà nombreux et nombreuses à vouloir rejoindre, Ashley notamment, qui est ici aujourd'hui. On va discuter toute l'année des belles images. Et ça va être vraiment un moment, alors différent que les Beauvoir Webinar Series, on est vraiment dans un contexte convivial et horizontal où chacun, chacune peut s'exprimer, où on brise les hiérarchies qu'on recrée de toute façon dans ces Beauvoir Webinar Series et qu'on essaie de questionner aussi. Mais voilà, n'hésitez pas à garder, à jeter un œil sur notre site internet, on l'annoncera très bientôt. Et la deuxième chose, c'est la prochaine session des Beauvoir Webinar Series. On va accueillir Nickel Provost. Ce sera encore un événement bilingue. Nickel, nous l'avons déjà accueilli dans les Beauvoir Webinar Series, notamment parce qu'elle a gagné le prix Patterson l'année dernière pour son article justement tiré de sa thèse. Et là, donc, c'est la publication de sa thèse qui est apparue aux presses universitaires de France. Et elle discutera son ouvrage avec Ouria Bentouami, qui est une philosophe française de l'université de Toulouse Jean Jaurès, et Jennifer McQueenie, que vous connaissez déjà, qui est en ce moment éditrice en chef de Simone de Beauvoir Studies, et qui nous fera le plaisir d'être avec nous encore une fois en janvier. Donc, c'est le 26 janvier, et nous lancerons bientôt les inscriptions.